May 1943, North Atlantic, 400 miles south of Iceland. Captain Lieutenant Max Martin Teichert raised the periscope of U-456 and swept the horizon, looking for the convoy his hydrophone operator had detected 20 minutes earlier. He could not yet know that what he was about to see would change everything he believed about submarine warfare. The water was dark. Heavy clouds blocked the moon. These were perfect conditions for a surface attack. U-boats hunted best at night, running on diesel engines, their low silhouettes nearly invisible against the black water. Teichert had used these tactics dozens of times. He had sunk 11 Allied ships. He was 28 years old and already wore the Knight's Cross. Then he saw it, a destroyer, moving directly toward his position, not searching, not zigzagging, coming straight at him through the darkness with the certainty of a hunter who knew exactly where his prey was hiding. Teichert's hand froze on the periscope. The destroyer was still 3,000 meters away but closing fast. He had not surfaced. He had not transmitted. He had done nothing that should have revealed his position. He ordered the boat to dive. Emergency dive. The crew responded instantly. Trained men moving through the practice drill. U-456 dropped into deeper water. The destroyer followed. Not to where the submarine had been, to where it was going. Depth charges began to fall. Close. Too close. The hull groaned under the pressure of the explosions. Light bulbs shattered. Men gripped whatever they could find and waited. This was not how it was supposed to work. This was happening all across the Atlantic. Convoys that should have been helpless were suddenly protected by screens of destroyers and corvettes that appeared at exactly the right moment. U-boats that approached on the surface found themselves illuminated by searchlights they never saw coming. Submarines running submerged were hunted by ships that seemed to track their every move. The hunters were becoming the hunted, and no one in the German Naval Command could explain why. The numbers told the story. In the first 3 weeks of May 1943, 41 U-boats were lost. 41. The entire previous year had cost 37 boats. In just 21 days, the U-boat force had suffered losses that exceeded 12 months of combat. The mathematics were brutal and clear. At this rate, the submarine fleet would be destroyed within 6 months. Teichert brought U-456 back to the surface 2 hours later. The destroyer was gone. The convoy was gone. His boat was damaged but still operational. He composed a message for headquarters. The enemy had detected him without visual contact. The enemy had tracked him while submerged. The enemy seemed to know where he was before he knew where they were. He was not the only commander sending such messages. The reports were piling up at U-boat headquarters in Paris and Berlin. Experienced captains, decorated officers, men who had survived 2 years of combat in the Atlantic, all of them describing the same phenomenon. The convoys were no longer vulnerable. The ocean was no longer safe. Something fundamental had changed. Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the U-boat fleet, read these reports with growing concern. Dönitz was not a man given to panic or exaggeration. He had spent his entire career in submarines. He had commanded U-boats in the First World War. He had built the Kriegsmarine submarine force from 77 boats in 1939 to over 400 by 1943. He understood naval warfare as well as any man alive, and he was beginning to understand something else. The Battle of the Atlantic was turning, not slowly, not gradually, but with the sudden violence of a door slamming shut. To understand what this meant, you must first understand what the U-boat fleet had accomplished in the years before May 1943. You must understand the fear these submarines had created, the shipping they had destroyed, and the confidence their commanders had carried into battle. You must understand what it meant when that confidence began to crack. To understand the shock that U-boat commanders felt in May 1943, you must first understand the years that came before. You must understand the period German submariners called the happy time, when the Atlantic Ocean belonged to them. It began in the summer of 1940. France had fallen. Britain stood alone. The Royal Navy was stretched across the globe, protecting convoys from Norway to Egypt, from Gibraltar to Singapore, and into this gap came the U-boats. Not the massive fleet that would come later, just a handful of submarines, 30 operational boats. But they were enough. The tactics were simple and devastatingly effective. A U-boat would locate a convoy during daylight hours, tracking it from a distance while submerged. Then, as darkness fell, the submarine would surface. On the surface, a U-boat could make 17 knots. Submerged, only 7. Surface running meant speed. It meant the ability to maneuver, and in the darkness, it meant invisibility. The submarine's low profile, painted grey, was nearly impossible to spot against black water. U-boat commanders would approach a convoy from astern, work their way between the columns of merchant ships, and fire torpedoes at point-blank range. Some commanders sank 4 ships in a single night. Some sank 6. Kapitän-Leutnant Otto Kretschmer perfected the technique. He commanded U-99. Between September 1939 and March 1941, he sank 47 ships. 47. His tactic was to penetrate inside the convoy itself, where merchant vessels were packed so tightly that every torpedo was almost guaranteed a hit. His standing order to his crew was direct: 1 torpedo per ship. We do not waste ammunition on corpses. The numbers from those months told a story of systematic destruction. In the second half of 1940, U-boats sank 274 Allied ships. In 1941, they sank 432. The convoys crossed the Atlantic with 40 or 50 vessels. 10 would be sunk, 15, 20. The survivors would limp into Liverpool or Halifax with tales of ships exploding in the night, of men burning in oil-slicked water, of U-boats surfacing among them like sharks. Winston Churchill, in his memoirs, was characteristically direct about what this meant. The only thing that ever really frightened me during the war was the U-boat peril, not the Luftwaffe, not the threat of invasion, the submarines, because Britain imported half its food and nearly all its raw materials. Every gallon of fuel oil for the RAF came across the Atlantic, every tank, every artillery shell. If the convoys stopped sailing, Britain would starve and the war would be lost. Churchill understood this. Dönitz understood this. Every U-boat commander understood this. They were not just sinking ships, they were strangling an island. By 1942, the U-boat force had grown, from 30 boats to over 100 operational submarines, from 100 to 300. Dönitz had argued for years that he needed 300 U-boats to win the war. Now he was getting them. New boats were being commissioned every month. New commanders were being trained. The production lines in Germany were running at full capacity. Dönitz moved his headquarters to a villa outside Paris, coordinating operations across the entire Atlantic. He introduced Wolfpack tactics, multiple submarines working together. One boat would find a convoy. Others would be directed to converge. They would attack simultaneously, overwhelming the escorts. The climax came in March 1943. In that single month, U-boats sank 95 Allied ships, nearly 100 vessels in 30 days. The tonnage lost exceeded 500,000 tons. At the same time, only 6 U-boats were destroyed. 6 lost, 95 sunk. The ratio was unsustainable for the Allies. If this continued, the invasion of Europe would be impossible. There would be no second front, no D-Day. The resources simply would not exist. March 1943 was the peak, the high water mark, the moment when the U-boat force came closest to achieving what Dönitz had promised. Control of the Atlantic, isolation of Britain, victory through starvation and attrition. And then, in April, something changed. The losses began to climb, not the Allied losses, the U-boat losses. Submarines were disappearing, experienced commanders were failing to return. Radio messages grew more desperate, and in May, the catastrophe arrived. What Tykert had experienced on U-456 was not an isolated incident. It was not bad luck or a single clever destroyer captain. It was the new reality. The Allies had found a way to see in the dark. They had found a way to track submarines that should have been invisible. The hunters had become the hunted, and no one in the German Navy understood how it had happened. The first signs had appeared in April. Isolated incidents, strange encounters, reports that seemed, at first, like nothing more than bad luck. Kapitän Lieutenant Klaus Bargsten commanded U-521 in the waters south of Greenland. On April 17th, his boat was hunting alone, searching for stragglers from a convoy that had scattered in a storm. The weather was thick. Visibility was less than a mile. Perfect conditions for a submarine. Bargsten was running on the surface using his diesel engines to cover ground quickly. Then, without warning, an aircraft appeared directly overhead. A twin-engine bomber. It dropped depth charges before Bargsten could give the order to dive. The bombs missed, but barely. U-521 crashed-dove and escaped. But the encounter left Bargsten shaken. The aircraft had come straight to him, through fog, through clouds, as if it had known exactly where to look. 3 days later, Korvettenkapitän Siegfried von Forstner in U-402 reported a similar incident. His boat was running submerged in the central Atlantic, far from any known convoy routes. A destroyer appeared on his hydrophones, then another, then a third. They formed a search pattern directly over his position. Von Forstner went deep. The destroyers followed. They dropped depth charges for 6 hours. U-402 survived, but only because von Forstner was an experienced commander who knew every trick of submarine evasion. His report to headquarters included a single sentence that would be repeated in dozens of other messages over the coming weeks. They knew where we were before we knew where they were. The reports multiplied through late April. U-boats were being attacked at night by destroyers they never saw. U-boats running on the surface were suddenly illuminated by searchlights from aircraft that approached without engine noise. U-boats attempting to shadow convoys were being depth-charged before they could get into attack position. Something had changed in the way the Allies were fighting. The German commanders could feel it. They could see it in the increased aggression of the escorts. They could measure it in the declining success rate of their attacks. The numbers were stark. In the first 20 days of April, 15 U-boats were lost, 15 submarines. Their crews totaled more than 700 men. Most of those men were now dead. At the same time, the tonnage of Allied shipping sunk was dropping. In March, U-boats had destroyed 95 ships. In April, the number fell to 56. The ratio was reversing. More U-boats lost, fewer merchant ships sunk. In the Bay of Biscay, U-boats transiting to and from their bases in France were being hunted with systematic precision. Aircraft appeared during the day. Destroyers appeared at night. The bay had always been dangerous. Now it was becoming a killing ground. Commanders began requesting permission to transit submerged, even though this would add days to their voyage and consume precious fuel. Some of those requests were denied. Submarines continued to be lost. In the North Atlantic, the gap was closing. For years, there had been an area in the middle of the ocean beyond the range of land-based aircraft. A zone roughly 600 miles wide where submarines could operate with relative safety from air attack. U-boat commanders called it the Black Pit. Now, in April and May of 1943, that gap was being covered. Not by land-based planes, which still could not reach that far, but by small aircraft carriers accompanying the convoys, single-engine fighters, slow, ungainly aircraft with limited range and small bomb loads. But they were there, overhead, circling, searching, and when they found a U-boat, they attacked. The technology was advancing faster than the Germans realized. The Allies had developed centimetric radar operating on a wavelength of 10 centimeters. U-boats carried radar detectors, but those detectors were designed for older radar systems operating on longer wavelengths. The new radar was invisible to German equipment. A U-boat commander on the surface at night believed himself undetected. He was wrong. The escorts could see him. The aircraft could see him. He was visible on their screens as a bright return signal. He just did not know it yet. Dönitz read the reports with increasing alarm. He ordered his technical staff to investigate. Could the Allies have developed new detection equipment? The answer came back uncertain. Possibly. But German scientists insisted that radar small enough and precise enough to detect a submarine at night was years away from practical deployment. The experts were confident. The commanders at sea were dying. And still, through all of April, no one considered the possibility that Enigma had been broken. The cipher machines were supposed to be unbreakable. The permutations ran into the billions. British intelligence might capture a few messages through traffic analysis or direction finding. But actually reading German naval communications, decrypting orders in real time, it was mathematically impossible. Or so the German naval staff believed. They were wrong. But they would not learn the truth for decades. In May 1943, all they knew was that something had gone catastrophically wrong. The ocean that had been their hunting ground was becoming their grave, and the men who had sailed into the Atlantic with confidence were sailing back, those who sailed back at all, with something very different in their eyes. May 24th, 1943, Boulevard Suchet, Paris, the villa that served as headquarters for the U-boat command. Admiral Karl Dönitz stood at his desk looking at the loss reports from the previous 3 weeks. The numbers were in front of him. Undeniable. Devastating. The reports had been arriving all morning. U-954, lost with all hands on May 7th. U-528, depth charged and sunk on May 11th. U-456, Teichert's boat, had made it back to port but was so damaged it would take months to repair. U-109, gone on May 4th. U-463, a supply submarine, destroyed on May 16th with supplies meant for 10 other boats. U-273, U-381, U-638, U-657. The list went on. Names, numbers, boats that would never return, men who were dead or captured, 41 submarines lost in 24 days. 41. Dönitz had commanded the U-boat force through 4 years of war. He had seen losses before. He expected losses. Submarine warfare was brutal by its nature. But this was different. This was not attrition. This was slaughter. He looked at the other numbers. The tonnage sunk. The number of Allied ships destroyed. The figures that should have justified the losses. In May, U-boats had sunk 50 Allied vessels. 50 ships for 41 submarines. The ratio had inverted. In the happy time, one U-boat could sink 10 ships and return safely. Now it took nearly one submarine lost for every ship sunk. The mathematics were unsustainable. At this rate, the U-boat force would cease to exist as an effective fighting force within months. His staff assembled in the operations room. Senior officers, men who had been with him since the beginning of the war. Konteradmiral Eberhard Gott, his chief of staff. Korvettenkapitän Günther Hessler, his son-in-law and tactical officer. Others. They knew why they had been summoned. They had seen the same reports. They understood what the numbers meant. Dönitz did not waste words. What he said next was not recorded in any official transcript, but the men in that room remembered it. Some of them survived the war. Some of them testified at Nuremberg. Some of them wrote memoirs, and all of them, decades later, described the same moment. The moment when Germany's submarine war in the Atlantic effectively ended. The Admiral's voice was quiet, almost flat. He had made his decision, and there was no emotion in the delivery. Just fact. Just recognition of a reality that could no longer be denied. We have lost the Battle of the Atlantic. The room was silent. Someone started to speak. Dönitz raised his hand. He was not finished. We are withdrawing from the North Atlantic convoy routes, effective immediately. All boats currently on station will return to base. No new patrols will be launched until we understand what has changed. We cannot continue to send men into an ocean where they cannot survive. Gott asked the obvious question. For how long? When would operations resume? Dönitz had no answer. He did not know. No one knew. The technical staff was still trying to determine what new weapons or detection systems the Allies had deployed. Until they understood that, until they could counter it, sending U-boats into the North Atlantic was not warfare. It was suicide. The withdrawal order went out that afternoon. Across the Atlantic, U-boat commanders received the same message: break off attacks, return to base. The reasons were not explained. They did not need to be. The men in the submarines already knew. They had been living with the reality for weeks. Now headquarters was finally acknowledging it. What this meant was immediately clear to anyone who understood naval strategy. The convoy routes were open. Britain would not starve. The supplies would flow. American troops would cross the Atlantic by the millions, unmolested by German submarines. The second front would happen. The invasion of Europe would proceed. Everything Dönitz had worked toward for 4 years, everything the U-boat force had fought for, was gone. The decision to withdraw was, in military terms, the only rational choice available. But it was also an admission, an acknowledgement that the Allies had achieved something the Germans could not explain and could not counter. The hunters had been driven from the sea. The ocean belonged to the convoys now. Years later, historians would identify May 1943 as the turning point in the Battle of the Atlantic, the month when the tide turned. But the men who experienced it did not think in such grand terms. They thought about empty berths in French ports. They thought about crews that would never sail again. They thought about orders to withdraw from an ocean they had once dominated. And they thought about the question that no one could answer. How had the Allies done it? What had changed? The answer would remain secret for decades. But in May 1943, in Paris and Berlin, and in every U-boat base from Norway to France, the Germans knew one thing with certainty. They had lost. The details did not matter. The war beneath the waves was over. The withdrawal from the North Atlantic took effect within days. U-boats scattered across the convoy routes received their orders and turned for home. Some had been at sea for 6 weeks, some for 8. They had sailed expecting to hunt convoys. They returned having been hunted themselves. The bases in France emptied. Not completely. U-boats still sailed. But the massive operations against the North Atlantic convoys, the wolf packs that had terrorized shipping for 3 years, were suspended. The pens at Lorient and Saint-Nazaire, which had seen submarines depart every few days, fell quiet. Crews that had lived with the constant rhythm of departure and return found themselves waiting for new tactics, waiting for new weapons, waiting for headquarters to solve a problem that had no immediate solution. The numbers told the rest of the story. In June, after the withdrawal, 13 U-boats were lost. Still a terrible figure, but not 41. In July, the number dropped to 37 boats lost for the entire month. The killing rate declined because the U-boats were no longer hunting in the same waters. They operated in the South Atlantic, in the Indian Ocean, in the Caribbean, anywhere except the main convoy routes between North America and Britain. Those routes were now effectively clear. The impact on the war was immediate and measurable. In the 6 months before May 1943, Allied shipping losses in the Atlantic averaged 300,000 tons per month. In the 6 months after, losses dropped to under 100,000 tons. Not because the Allies were building more ships, though they were, but because the U-boats had been forced to retreat from the hunting grounds that mattered most. The irony was that the Germans never fully understood why they had lost. Dönitz and his staff believed the Allies had developed new radar technology. This was true. They believed Allied air cover had improved. This was also true, but the decisive factor, the breakthrough that had turned the battle, remained hidden. The Allies had broken Enigma. British cryptanalysts at Bletchley Park were reading German naval communications almost in real time. When a U-boat reported its position, the Allies knew. When Dönitz ordered a wolf pack to concentrate on a convoy, the Allies knew. They rerouted the convoys. They positioned destroyers along the U-boat patrol lines. They sent aircraft to precisely where submarines were operating. The Germans suspected something. Traffic analysis suggested the Allies were responding too quickly, too precisely. to be relying on radar alone. But the possibility that Enigma itself had been compromised was rejected. The cipher system was too complex. The number of possible settings was too vast. German naval intelligence convinced themselves that the Allies were getting lucky, or perhaps they had captured codebooks from a sunken U-boat. But the fundamental security of Enigma was never seriously questioned. Not in 1943, not in 1944, not even at the end of the war. Some of the U-boat commanders from those months did not survive. Teichert, who had experienced the uncanny precision of Allied detection in May, was killed in action in November 1943 when U-456 was sunk in the Mediterranean. Bergsten survived the war. So did von Forstner. They became merchant sailors after 1945. They never learned, not until decades later when British secrecy was finally lifted, how the Allies had tracked them so precisely through the dark Atlantic waters. Otto Kretschmer, the most successful U-boat commander of the war, had already been captured by March 1941. He spent 4 years in a prisoner of war camp in Canada. When he was released, he returned to Germany and eventually joined the new German Navy. In the 1950s and 60s, he served alongside former Allied officers. They became colleagues, friends, and still no one told him. Not until 1974, when the British government finally acknowledged the extent of the Enigma breakthrough, did Kretschmer learn that many of his successes had been possible, partly because the British had allowed certain convoys to sail unprotected, rather than reveal that they were reading German codes. Dönitz continued to command the U-boat force until the end of the war. He launched new campaigns. He introduced new tactics. Schnorkel devices that allowed submarines to run their diesel engines while submerged. Acoustic torpedoes that homed on the sound of ships' propellers. Newer, faster submarines designed to operate entirely underwater. Some of these innovations were effective. None of them changed the fundamental reality established in May 1943. The Battle of the Atlantic was over. Germany had lost. The cost could be measured in ships. Over 3,000 Allied vessels sunk during the war. But it could also be measured in lives. Of the roughly 40,000 men who served in German U-boats during the war, 30,000 died, 3 out of every 4. No branch of any military in the Second World War suffered casualty rates that high. The young men who had celebrated their successes in the happy time, who had worn their knight's crosses and believed themselves invincible, had sailed into an ocean that became, for most of them, a grave. By late 1943, the remaining U-boat crews knew the truth. They knew the odds. They sailed anyway. Not because they believed they could win, but because they were ordered to. Because stopping meant admitting defeat. Because the war demanded it. They went back to sea in submarines that were now obsolete. They hunted convoys they could not reach. They fought a battle that had already been lost, and most of them never came home. The decision Dönitz made in May was tactical, a temporary withdrawal to reassess and regroup. But everyone who understood naval warfare knew it was something more than that. It was the end. Not announced, not formalized, just acknowledged quietly in operations rooms and submarine pens across occupied Europe. The Atlantic had turned, the hunters had been driven off, and nothing would change that fact again. May 1943, North Atlantic, 400 miles south of Iceland. The moment when Teichert raised his periscope and saw the destroyer coming through the darkness. That moment, repeated across the Atlantic in dozens of U-boats over the course of 3 weeks, marked the end of something that had seemed, just months before, unstoppable. By June, the submarine pens in France showed the change. The constant rhythm of departures had ceased. Boats that would have sailed remained in port. Crews waited for orders that did not come. The bases were not empty, but they were quiet in a way they had not been since 1940. The confidence was gone. The certainty. The belief that the Atlantic belonged to Germany. In its place was something else. Caution. Calculation. The recognition that the mathematics had turned against them. The long-term consequences extended far beyond naval warfare. With the North Atlantic secure, the build-up for D-Day proceeded without interruption. American troops crossed the ocean by the millions. Tanks, artillery, supplies, everything needed for the invasion of Europe flowed across shipping lanes that U-boats no longer dominated. The second front became possible because the first front, the battle for control of the Atlantic, had been decided. Not through a single dramatic engagement, not through a climactic naval battle, but through the steady accumulation of losses that became unsustainable. What the Germans did not know in May 1943 would not be revealed for 30 years. The breaking of Enigma remained one of the most closely guarded secrets of the war. Even after 1945, even after Germany surrendered, the British said nothing. They kept the captured Enigma machines. They kept the techniques. They shared the secret with almost no one. Former U-boat commanders went to their graves believing they had been defeated by radar and aircraft and simple Allied determination. Some of them were correct, but the full truth was more complete than they ever knew. When the secret finally emerged in the 1970s, the reaction among surviving German naval officers was not anger. It was recognition. The strange precision of Allied responses, the uncanny ability of escorts to appear at exactly the right moment, the way convoys seemed to know where U-boats were patrolling. All of it made sense now. The mystery that had haunted them for decades was solved. They had been fighting an enemy who could read their orders before the orders were executed. No amount of courage or tactical skill could overcome that disadvantage. The philosophical dimension of the Atlantic battle was this: technology changes warfare, not slowly, not predictably, but in sudden, decisive shifts that render yesterday's tactics obsolete. The U-boat commanders of 1943 were using the same methods that had worked brilliantly in 1941. Surface at night, approach unseen, attack from close range. Those tactics had not changed, but the world around them had. Radar had advanced, aircraft coverage had expanded, code breaking had progressed from theoretical possibility to operational reality. The ocean that had been dark became visible. The submarines that had been invisible were tracked, and the war changed in a matter of weeks. There was no moment of surrender, no formal acknowledgement of defeat, just a quiet order to withdraw. Boats returning to port, crews realizing they would not be sailing again, not into those waters, not on those missions. The Battle of the Atlantic did not end with a climactic engagement. It ended with a recognition of mathematics. More U-boats lost than could be replaced. Fewer ships sunk than were needed to matter. A ratio that could only lead one direction. The survivors carried something with them for the rest of their lives. Not guilt necessarily, not shame, but knowledge. They had been part of something that came close to succeeding. In the winter of 1942 and the spring of 1943, the U-boats had brought Britain to the edge. Churchill's fear had been real. The statistics supported it. And then, in a single month, it collapsed. Not because the U-boat force stopped fighting, but because the rules of the battle had changed in ways the Germans could not see and could not counter. In those French submarine pens, years after the war ended, you could still see the marks where the boats had tied up. The concrete cradles where submarines were serviced between patrols, the blast doors designed to protect the boats from Allied bombing. All of it remained. A monument to a campaign that had lasted nearly 6 years and cost tens of thousands of lives on both sides. Tourists would walk through eventually. Guides would explain the history. But the men who had sailed from those pens, the ones who survived, rarely returned. There was nothing there they needed to see again. What Tykert saw through his periscope that night in May 1943 was the future. A destroyer that should not have known where to look. A hunter that had become prey. An ocean that had turned. He brought U-456 back to port. He filed his report. He waited for new orders. The orders came eventually. But they were different now. Cautious. Limited. Defensive. The war continued for 2 more years. The U-boats continued to sail. But the battle for the Atlantic, the campaign that might have starved Britain into surrender, was over. Not because the submarines stopped fighting, not because the crews lost courage, but because the Allies had learned to see in the dark. And once that happened, once the ocean became visible, the advantage shifted and never shifted back. That was the lesson of May 1943. Not a lesson about bravery or determination, a lesson about technology, about information, about the moment when invisibility becomes visibility and everything changes.